It was a cold gray morning in April of 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing by the hour. Roads were jammed with retreating soldiers, burning vehicles, terrified civilians, and columns of refugees fleeing westward with whatever they could carry in their hands. Some carried suitcases. Others carried children. Most carried fear. And on a muddy road outside the German town of Zwickau, a 19-year-old German corporal named Hans Brandt stood completely alone at a crossroads and made a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. Behind him, the Soviet Red Army was advancing faster than anyone thought possible. In front of him, American troops from the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division were moving east through the countryside. Brandt looked down at his rifle. 4 bullets left. That was all. His boots had holes in both soles, stuffed with scraps of paper ripped from a burned farmhouse. He had not eaten in 2 days. For 6 straight months he had fought on the Eastern Front, and somehow survived unwounded. But now the war was over. And he knew it. Slowly, Hans Brandt stepped onto the road toward the Americans, raised both hands, and surrendered. But what he said afterward shocked the American soldiers interviewing him. Because Brandt explained something they would hear again. And again. And again. From hundreds of German prisoners during the final months of World War II. He said, "I surrendered to the Americans because I wanted to survive." And then he explained exactly why he refused the Soviets. What followed revealed one of the most extraordinary realities of the Second World War. A reality so powerful that entire German armies deliberately fled westward, not to escape defeat, but to choose who defeated them. Because by 1945, German soldiers had reached a terrifying conclusion. American captivity meant life. Soviet captivity might mean death. And the difference between the two changed the final months of the war forever. To understand why German soldiers feared Soviet capture so deeply, you have to understand what the Eastern Front really was. The fighting between Germany and the Soviet Union was not an ordinary war. It was annihilation. Entire cities vanished. Villages were burned to the ground. Millions of soldiers disappeared into forests, frozen fields, and mass graves. The brutality reached levels almost impossible to imagine today. German soldiers witnessed Soviet prisoners starving by the millions. Soviet troops witnessed German atrocities across occupied territory. And as the war dragged on, hatred hardened into something colder and more dangerous. Revenge. By 1944, the Red Army was pushing westward with unstoppable momentum. And German soldiers retreating from the east began spreading stories. Stories about Soviet prison camps, forced labor, executions, disappearances. Men who surrendered and were never seen again. Some rumors were exaggerated. Others were horrifyingly true. But what mattered most was this. German soldiers believed them. And in war, belief can become more powerful than reality itself. Meanwhile, something very different was happening on the Western Front. German prisoners captured by American forces were sending letters home. Those letters described something almost unimaginable to soldiers still fighting in the ruins of Europe. Food, medical care, clean barracks, mail from family members. Some prisoners even described drinking coffee, eating fresh bread, and being treated respectfully by American guards. At first, many Germans refused to believe it. Nazi propaganda had spent years portraying Americans as weak, corrupt, and brutal. But the reports kept coming. And they all said the same thing. The Americans followed rules. And most importantly, the Americans kept prisoners alive. That information spread through the German army like wildfire. Not through official channels, but through whispers, rumors, conversations between exhausted soldiers in foxholes, stories traded during retreats, letters read aloud in bomb shelters. By the final year of the war, countless German troops understood something critical. If captured by the Americans, there was a realistic chance they would eventually go home. But Soviet captivity felt like stepping into darkness. And as the Red Army advanced deeper into Germany, panic began spreading through entire units. Because surrender in 1945 was no longer just a military act. It was a decision about your future. Maybe your survival. Maybe your family. Maybe whether anyone would ever see you again. The Americans processed enormous numbers of prisoners during the war. By 1945, the United States held approximately 425,000 German and Italian prisoners of war. And many Germans were stunned by what they experienced inside American prison camps. The camps stretched across dozens of U.S. states: Texas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, Washington State. Some prisoners worked on farms harvesting crops. Others worked in factories or lumber operations. They received wages. Not large wages, but wages nonetheless. They had access to medical treatment, male privileges, food that, in some cases, was better than what civilians inside Germany were receiving during the final months of the war. Some camps even had libraries, soccer leagues, music groups, educational programs. For many prisoners, the experience completely shattered everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about America. One German POW later recalled seeing grocery stores in the United States overflowing with food while Germany starved under bombing and rationing. Another remembered tasting Coca-Cola for the first time. Others talked about American civilians waving at them while they worked in fields. To exhausted German soldiers coming from the Eastern Front, it felt unreal. But there was another reason American treatment mattered so much. The United States followed the Geneva Convention. That meant prisoner treatment was not random. It was policy. And German soldiers noticed. If conditions in camps fell below standard, inspections followed. Reports were filed. Corrections were made. Word spread quickly that surrendering to Americans meant entering a system with rules. Predictable rules. And in a collapsing world filled with chaos, predictability became priceless. The Soviet Union operated very differently. The Soviets had never signed the 1929 Geneva Convention regarding prisoners of war. Even worse, Soviet doctrine viewed surrender itself as deeply dishonorable. Many Soviet soldiers captured earlier in the war were treated as traitors upon returning home. German troops knew this, and they believed Soviet forces would show them little mercy in return. As the Red Army advanced westward in 1944 and 1945, stories multiplied. Columns of prisoners disappearing east. Forced labor camps. Starvation. Executions. Disease. West German investigations after the war estimated that over 1 million German prisoners died in Soviet captivity. Soviet records claimed lower numbers. Historians still debate the exact figure today. But one thing is absolutely certain. German soldiers in 1945 believed Soviet captivity was a nightmare. And that belief changed battlefield behavior dramatically. Entire German units began surrendering to the Western Allies whenever possible. Some divisions resisted fiercely against Soviet forces, only to surrender quickly once American troops appeared. Thousands of soldiers intentionally moved westward during retreats. Not east. West. Toward the Americans. The pattern became impossible for Allied commanders to ignore. In just the first 3 weeks of April 1945, American forces captured more than 300,000 German prisoners. And many of those surrenders were organized. Calculated. Deliberate. German officers understood the war was lost. The only remaining question was, who would capture them first? One of the clearest examples came inside the Ruhr pocket. By April 1945, hundreds of thousands of German troops were trapped by advancing Allied forces. Their commander, Field Marshal Walter Model, refused to formally surrender. A loyalist to the end, Model believed German military honor demanded resistance or death. On April 21, 1945, he committed suicide. But his soldiers made a different choice. More than 325,000 surrendered to the Americans. Many simply stacked their rifles beside roads and walked toward U.S. lines with white flags raised. The war had broken something inside the German army. Not courage. Not discipline. But belief. Millions no longer believed dying for Hitler made sense. And they especially no longer wanted Soviet captivity. The fear was simply too great. American intelligence officers soon discovered another unexpected advantage. German prisoners talked. A lot. Especially when treated well. One of the most fascinating interrogation centers of the entire war operated secretly at Fort Hunt, Virginia. Thousands of German prisoners passed through the facility between 1942 and 1945. The interrogators there used almost no physical pressure. Instead, they relied on psychology, comfortable rooms, friendly conversations, chess games, cigarettes, good meals. The prisoners often believed they were simply relaxing among fellow Germans. But hidden microphones recorded everything. Every conversation. Every careless comment. Every military secret. The operation produced mountains of intelligence that helped Allied commanders throughout the war. And perhaps the most extraordinary detail of all. Many interrogators were Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany years earlier. Some had lost family members in the Holocaust. Now they sat across from German officers discussing military strategy over coffee and ping-pong. It was one of the strangest moral ironies of the war. But according to those involved, the system worked because prisoners were treated like human beings. One interrogator later said, "You got more information with kindness than fear." And history largely proved him right. As Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, the race westward intensified. German officers began openly maneuvering entire formations toward American lines. One general after another reached the same conclusion. American surrender offered hope. Soviet surrender offered uncertainty. Perhaps no example was more dramatic than General Wenck. In April 1945, Hitler ordered Wenck's 12th Army to relieve Berlin. The situation was hopeless. Berlin was already surrounded. The Red Army was closing in from every direction. Wenck understood immediately that saving Hitler was impossible. So he ignored the order. Instead, he turned his army westward. Over the following days, Wenck's forces helped ferry hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers across the Elbe River toward American lines before Soviet forces arrived. It became one of the largest unofficial rescue operations of the war. Men, women, children, wounded soldiers, refugees, all moving desperately westward, trying to reach the Americans first. An estimated 100,000 people escaped Soviet capture because of Wenck's decision. And again, the reason was simple. People believed American captivity meant survival. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story came after the war ended. Many German prisoners returned home carrying memories that completely conflicted with the propaganda they had believed for years. They expected hatred, cruelty, revenge. Instead, many remembered American camps as strangely humane places during humanity's darkest conflict. One former POW captured in 1944 later returned to the United States decades afterward. Standing outside the former prison camp gates, now an ordinary military base, he quietly thanked the Americans who had guarded him. He remembered the first time he bought ice cream inside the camp canteen. Germany had been starving. Bombed cities lay in ruins. But in America, he found abundance, safety, normal life continuing thousands of miles away from the destruction consuming Europe. That memory stayed with him for the rest of his life. And he was not alone. Back outside Zwickau in April of 1945, Hans Brandt had already done the arithmetic. 4 bullets left. No food. No future for Germany. And somewhere behind him, the Soviet army was closing in. So he walked west. Like hundreds of thousands of others. Not because he loved America. Not because he believed in democracy. Not because propaganda convinced him, but because he believed the Americans followed rules. And in the final days of World War II, that belief may have saved his life. The German soldiers who surrendered to American forces were not choosing victory. They were choosing probability. Probability of food. Probability of survival. Probability of eventually seeing their families again. And by 1945, the numbers were not close. Because in the ruins of collapsing Europe, one truth had spread from soldier to soldier with absolute clarity. If you had a choice, you surrendered west, not east.